Thank you, everybody, for coming out today to our special presentation by a very esteemed colleague of mine, Dr. Christina Clark-Kazak, who I'm just going to say, in my humble opinion, is one of my favorite academics because she's an action-oriented scholar. So you won't find her just in books and articles and conferences. You will find her working in the grassroots on the front lines. So you're one of the people who walks the walk and talks the talk. And so I'm very honored that you could spend some time with us today. I've had the privilege of taking a look at your CV, and I can't read all of your accolades and awards because there's just too many, but I'm going to give you a little preview. So Christina is currently a professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. In addition, she used to be a professor at York University and St. Paul's University, but she also worked for the Canadian government and at the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. She's previously served as the president of the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies. She was the director of York University's Refugee Studies Center and Associate Dean Research and Graduate Studies at York University's bilingual Glendon campus. She is a past president of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, and she's the outgoing editor-in-chief of Refuge, Canada's Journal on Refugees, which she made an open access publication so that all of us can learn from one another and the great research that gets done in refugee research. In addition to all of that, Christina is an internationally recognized research leader in migration studies, where she has made her mark by studying immigrants and refugees, especially around the issues of age discrimination, ethics, and equitable access to education and research in migration contexts. Her award-winning interdisciplinary collaborative work is widely recognized as theoretically and methodologically novel and practically grounded in the lived realities of migration, which is why I say she walks the walk. In my humble opinion, like you've written a lot, 12 books, most people don't even get half of that in their career, in addition to dozens of peer-reviewed articles and chapters. My favorite work of yours is the work on research ethics and working with refugees. I use that all the time, and many of my students are in the crowd. They've all read it. This past month, I'm going to share you this one cool thing about her. Dr. Clark-Kazak was invited to a private audience with Pope Leo XV in Rome to discuss her work. Super cool. But the thing that attracts me the most to her work is the fact that she's able to bridge academic and real life issues. And so she served as faculty advisor to the World University Student Canada refugee program at York University for over 10 years, and then took that post over to the University of Ottawa. I have a warm feeling about that program because I'm the academic advisor here. And so she also serves on the University of Ottawa's Scholar at Risk Committee. It's a committee that helps bring academics to Canada who are in war situations. And if this is not enough, in her spare time, in quotation marks, she leads several community groups in sponsoring refugees who are coming to Canada. So I am in very awe of your work. I only brought 2 of her books. This one's in French, but it's also in English, but they're also open access. So you can read these for free online. Today, she's going to probably talk about her smaller book, a little bit of it, about aging in and out of place and about migration issues. We don't talk about aging and migration so much. And so I would consider Christina the world's scholar foremost on this very issue. And so I'm very pleased that she's here today, and I'm going to shut up and give the floor over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was really such a warm welcome. And I also am in awe of Lori. She's one of the first people who introduced me actually to the issue of aging. We had very early in my career at York University, we had a workshop, and she came to that workshop. So I'm very pleased to be here. And thank you so much for coming and making time out of your busy day. I know this is a busy time of year and it's a beautiful sunny day, so I'm competing with the weather here today. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the forthcoming book that's coming out with UBC Press that looks at age discrimination in Canadian immigration policy, but I can also touch briefly on the other smaller book that was written for a public audience that's looking at the intersection of aging and migration. So I just want to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on Indigenous territories here in Winnipeg, but also where I live and work in what is now Ottawa. And I think when we're thinking about forcible displacement and immigration, we need to acknowledge that Canada is a settler state. It was built on the forcible displacement of Indigenous peoples, not only from their lands, but also from their communities, their languages, their families. And I also think when we're thinking about aging, which is what we're talking about today, we need to recognize that it's socially constructed and that other communities, including Indigenous communities, have different perceptions of aging and interrelationships across generations. Maybe I should have gone with the clicker, Teddy. Anyway, I wanted to also thank Lori again for the warm invitation. I also wanted to thank Pauline for having organized today's session and Teddy for setting up all the tech. And I also I have to acknowledge that Shirk was the one who funded the research that I am presenting today. I just want to start by acknowledging where I sit in terms of my positionality. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. I actually never intended to become an academic. I started my career as a diplomat. I worked for 8 years with the Canadian government. I took a leave of absence to do a degree in international development studies. And my work really sits at the intersection of policy, but also draws on anthropology, sociology. And this particular piece that I'm going to present today looks at Canada's immigration law, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, but I am not a legal scholar. So it's really informed by thinking across disciplines. I also think about when we're thinking about aging, because it is so individually specific, but also situated in community. The fact that I grew up in a tiny fishing village in northern British Columbia and also grew up on boats means that I have a different perception of childhood than my children growing up now with cell phones in an urban environment. They're also racialized, so they have a different experience of growing up and a different experience with immigration because I, as a white settler, there's a presumption that I'm Canadian. Where someone who's racialized, there's a presumption that they're not Canadian or they have to explain where they're from. And so I think that when we're thinking about aging and immigration, we need to acknowledge where we sit and where these are situated within the power relations. So what I'm going to do today is give a bit of an overview of why I came up with this specific topic, sort of the research puzzle and the conceptual framework. Then I'm going to go into some of the key findings that come out of the work. And then I'm going to end with some recommendations. So the research puzzle basically started with this idea that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom applies to everyone who is present in Canada, including non-citizens. So this was the Singh decision, which established that everyone who is present in Canada is protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in the Charter and Rights and Freedoms, it's very clear that age is an equity category. So we're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of age in hiring, for example, or in other situations. But what is very clear is that immigration and refugee policy has very explicit and sometimes implicit discrimination on the basis of chronological age, what I call social age, and also family status. And the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and all of the policies in Canada are supposed to be consistent with the Charter. So why do we have this kind of policy gap? Again, I sit in a public policy school. I'm a former public servant. I'm trying to understand what is the kind of policy rationale behind this. But also, given that we're talking about an immigration context, what are the bordering practices that basically work to include and exclude on the basis of age and family status? Yeah, thank you. This is great.
Sure. Yeah.
What is social age? So this is a concept that I developed during my PhD research, but draws on a lot of other people's work. I wouldn't say that this is particularly novel, but basically the idea here is that age is socially constructed. So yes, there's a biological process of aging, but we make meanings depending on our particular context. And so social age is very similar to like a concept like gender, where, yes, there are realities, there are biological differences, but they're made meaningful in particular relationships and particular contexts. And when we're thinking about relationships, we need to think about power both within and between generations, and how one experiences aging is also dependent on where one sits in other social locations, including gender, class, ability, disability, religion. Even birth order, for example, will depend on your experience with aging. So the dominant focus to aging really focuses on chronological age. So this is codified within Canadian law. We also have international conventions like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely ratified convention in the world. Does anyone know the only country that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Yes, the US, mostly because of the so-called parental right movement. So the CRC is very widely ratified. We have other legislation that codifies age. And so chronological age becomes kind of like a socially acceptable marker for thinking about aging. And in a way, it does serve as a proxy for biological development, right? So whether a person is a day old or a year old or 10 years old or 50 years old or 100 years old, that gives us an indication of where they are in the life course. But it's not sufficient. So we need to complement the thinking about chronological age with other ways of thinking about aging. And so some of the limits of chronological age, the first one is that people don't necessarily have proof or documents to prove their chronological age. And this is particularly the case in immigration contexts, particularly if people have had to flee without having, forcibly displaced people who haven't had a chance to go home and get all of their documents. And so in these cases, the United Nations, the Refugee Agency, often gives people what Kimberly Siebel calls a bureaucratic birth date. So in other words, they'll ask people, do you, or a parent, do you remember, was your child born before or after this particular presidential election or an earthquake or some kind of other event? And then they give them either a January 1 or sometimes a July 1 birth date. And so basically, this is an approximation. And sometimes these bureaucratic birth dates are actually off by several years, which then causes problems for a whole host of different reasons, because chronological age is so much part of our context in Canada. Registering a kid for school, going to medical appointments, getting access to CPP, all of these things are dependent on chronological age. The other reason why chronological age is limiting is because in many other cultures and contexts, there are other physical or social markers that are as, if not more important than chronological age. So things like puberty, menopause, graying of hair, whether or not someone is enrolled in full-time education. So those of you who are studying here at the university, there sometimes is an infantilization of university students, right? Even some of my colleagues call their students like kids, because there's this idea that somehow people are not quite an adult if they're still studying. Same thing with full-time employment. Often you need to have a full-time job in order to be considered to be kind of a full adult within many societies. And finally, chronological age is often perceived, and again, I'm a former public servant, so many government people will say, okay, even if chronological age is imperfect, it's easy, and it's also administratively fair, because we just make a cutoff, and before that cutoff, people are eligible, or after that cutoff, people are not eligible. Yes, however, there's inconsistencies. So, for example, in Canada, given that we're a federal state, there's huge variation across different provinces, from a low age of 16 to an upper age of 19 of who's considered to be a child. And it also depends on whether we're considered a child, a minor, or a minor for child protection purposes. The other thing that's interesting about this is, for example, one of the provinces also, it combines chronological, Saskatchewan, unmarried person under 16. So that combines chronological age with social age. There's a social marker of marriage as well as a chronological age. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that even chronological age is socially constructed, right? It's made meaningful administratively because we've decided that 18 or 19 is the cutoff. But nothing miraculously happens on a person's 18th or 19th birthdays to make them all of a sudden become an adult. And so what I adopt in my work is a life course approach. I'm not suggesting that chronological age is not significant. It does serve a purpose. There's still a utility in having chronological age disaggregated statistics, for example, but it's made meaningful in particular contexts, and it can't be just that. We need to be thinking about social age and relationships and aging as a much more holistic kind of picture. In this book, I look at discrimination, and I'm interested in direct discrimination where people are very clearly treated differently on the basis of chronological age. So, for example, in the comprehensive ranking system, the point system, if you're under the age of 18 or over the age of 45, you get 0 points. That's very clearly direct discrimination because you're giving people points on the basis of their chronological age. It's also important to look at indirect discrimination, particularly in context of equity, right? Because sometimes you might want to you treat people differently because they're in different contexts. And so indirect discrimination happens when people are all treated the same, but it has a differential impact on people. So here an example would be immigration detention. Detention is proven to have a disproportionately negative effect on children and also on older people. And so even if everyone is incarcerated, it has a different impact on people because of where they are in the life course. The other thing when we're thinking about immigration that's really important to acknowledge is that immigration has always been discretionary. The whole point of immigration is to decide who can come into Canada and who cannot come into Canada. This is the right of a sovereign state. In fact, it's like a definition of sovereignty is having control over borders and having control over citizenship and who belongs. And in fact, I mean, historically, we've seen this. This is a quote from then Immigration Minister Fairclough in 1958. But this quote could happen today. Immigration is selective. It's discretionary. Canada has the right to decide who can come in because we're always going to have more people who want to come than the places we have. And even this language of absorptive capacity is very important because when we think about absorptive capacity, it also depends on who we're talking about and where they are in the life course. And I'll get back to this in a minute. The other thing I would also say is that immigration policy is implemented by people, and people are making decisions based, yes, on the rules and the regulations, but also on their interpretation of those. And so when we're thinking about social age, this brings in an element of discretion because individual agents are deciding. But also in Canada, immigration is very politicized. So most members of parliament, their offices deal with huge numbers of immigration-related issues. And so they also put pressure on their political colleagues in order to admit people or not admit people. So there's a huge element of discretion within immigration policy. So in the book, I used a mixed methodology. The first thing I did was a textual analysis to try to understand the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or IRPA, and the regulations. So the regulations are basically the policy document that tells people how to interpret the law. I am not a lawyer. This is not a legal analysis. What I'm interested in is actually the ways in which different age categories and different family categories are talked about in the regulations and in the law. I also did semi-structured interviews with people who work with the law and policies, including lawyers. I should put here former government officials, because no current government officials agreed to speak with me. And the ATIP, it took so long that finally the book was published without getting that access to information. And also representatives of migration serving organizations. Some of these people are also people with lived experience of displacement or immigration, but I didn't specifically do interviews with people who were, because I'm more interested in the policy framework. And then I chose 3 case studies which basically show age discrimination, and these came out of the interviews. So the first is the comprehensive ranking system, or the point system. This was cited by everyone. When I asked, is there an example you can think of age discrimination? Everyone pointed to this because it's so blatant. The second was immigration detention. And the third is looking at refugee protection. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a very brief detail. So basically what this research shows is that age discrimination is deeply embedded in the policies. It's also interesting because immigration policy tends to be separated out into labor, family, and humanitarian. And I took case studies across those different ones because I was trying to understand kind of the logic, and we see that it's actually in all of these cases. And there's also ageist stereotypes. And again, I'll show some examples of this in a minute, but there's definitely socially constructed notions of what older people, for example, are and are not going to contribute to the Canadian economy. But these are not necessarily borne out actually in the empirical evidence. And so there's ageist stereotypes, and I think this is actually reflective of society as a whole. So, for example, if we had 0 points for being a woman, or 0 points for being part of a racialized group, or 0 points for being part of coming from a particular country, people would say, like, this is not okay. But we have 0 points, and the comprehensive ranking system has been in place for decades, and no one has gone out and done protests in the streets to say this is discriminatory. So it's because it's normalized within Canadian society, these sort of ageist underlying assumptions. And the bordering practices that are discriminatory are rationalized by saying, again, a bit like the earlier quote from the former minister, this idea that we have limited spaces, we have limited capacity, and so we're going to choose the people who are best for Canada. However, underlying this discourse, we're not thinking about people as people in relationships. We're thinking about individuals, often adult immigrants. And so actually, this is also a problematic kind of discourse. Okay, so turning to the key findings. So the first chapter does a historical overview. Obviously, I don't do as much of an in-depth study of all the laws and policies since Confederation as I do in the current IRPA, Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. But it was very important for me to do this historical context because it helped to show actually over time what was consistent, but also what changed over time. So the first thing that was very clear was that the definitions of who age-related and family-related definitions changed significantly over time, but they didn't change in one, it wasn't a linear change. Basically, there would be variations depending on what would be better for the Canadian state at any particular time. So I'll give you an example of the British home children. So, for example, this was a deliberate policy of bringing poor, in some cases orphaned, but in many cases kids actually had parents from the British Isles to Canada to serve basically as indentured labor. They were given to families, and in some cases the families adopted them, but in many cases they were basically just free labor. They worked on farms, they did domestic work, they did childcare. So like the Anne of Green Gables kind of story, this is what happened for the British home children. And so in this case, the state very much facilitated and actually encouraged the migration of children to Canada, and they were unaccompanied children. They were children who were coming here without parents. The other thing, too, that's very clear when we look at the historical record is that age doesn't operate alone. It intersects with gender, with disability and ability, and with other kind of markers. So this example from the Naturalization Act, where disability is defined as, quote, the status of being a married woman or a minor, lunatic, or idiot. So there's ableist language that intersects actually with age discrimination. And like age discrimination, ableism is still very present in Canadian immigration policy, right? There still is a lot of ways in which the Canadian state prevents people who will be an excessive demand on the Canadian state from coming to Canada. The other thing that was very apparent by looking at these laws and policies over time was the increased bureaucratization of it. So even the length of each policy was exponentially, like it started off with was just 1 or 2 pages of laws. And then it now the IRPA is like this thick when you print it out. So the idea here is that we're becoming more and more detailed in how we're thinking about these categories and more specific in how we're defining these different groups. And private relationships, including family, are scrutinized because there's this assumption of fraud. There's this fear that people are going to somehow be using these categories to fraud the Canadian immigration system. This is the analysis. So this is chapter 2, which basically I did the age categories within the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. I was interested in the frequency of the terms, but then we also did analysis of the meanings behind them. So what comes out very clearly here is basically the age category that's the most important is child. And in this case, I'm only interested in child as an age category, not as a family category, because that's a separate analysis. And so what we see from this analysis is that child is overwhelmingly the most cited age category, but it's differentially defined from 14 all the way up to 22 years. So the dependent child definition is you have to be 22 years and unmarried. This is also very interesting because it was the subject of different policies. So the previous Conservative government had lowered it to 19, and then the Liberals re-raised it when they came back into power. And there also is an intersection here with disability. So if someone can be over the age of 22, if they can prove that in fact it's a disabled child who depends on the family. Infants, so very young children and very old people are not talked about it really at all in IRPA because they're not perceived to be immigrants. They're not perceived to really be the subjects really of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Young people are only cited very infrequently, and they're almost always associated with criminology. And then the very few cases when they're not, it's with education programs, particularly post-secondary education programs. So they're being constructed as basically problematic or potentially problematic, or people who are in the process of studying. So basically this shows that adults are the default migrants. So the whole system is set up with this idea that we're trying to attract people to Canada in a very narrow, and even when we're talking about adults here, it's adults under a certain age. We're not talking, and again, the cutoff for the comprehensive ranking system is very low at 45. So this is signaling that after 45, someone is not a contribution to the Canadian economy. In terms of family categories, here, the most frequently cited family category is spouse or partner. I don't go into a lot of detail on that because there are many other colleagues, including Meg Gauscher, who works on this issue. So I was more interested in the family categories that related to age, including, and also the definition of family. So what we see is that family reunification is one of the stated objectives of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. It's also one of the categories of immigration. But again, we see a very narrow definition of family being the nuclear family, except in certain cases, which I will show you mostly in relation to humanitarian immigration. But also the way the family is constructed is there's an assumption of dependence. So it really is this idea that a family is basically a single person, often a male, and all their dependents. There's not this idea that family is like an relational kind of situation. So we see these kind of carried through in terms of the different case studies. The first case study is looking at the point system. I've already kind of alluded to this. But I think that's what's kind of interesting also when you think historically. The whole reason why the point system was introduced was because historically Canada's immigration policy was explicitly racist. And so the point system was brought in to try to ensure that that would be eliminated. But it very clearly discriminates on the basis of age. And in some cases, this also intersects with family status because you get points for your spouse if the spouse is also an attractive immigrant to Canada. Otherwise, the spouse actually reduces your score. It's the same thing also if you have a sibling in Canada. You get additional points if you have a sibling in Canada. So it's this idea that if you have a family member in Canada, that family member is going to help you to integrate better. So, I mean, again, on the point system, from a policy perspective, obviously people are going to say, well, it makes sense because the whole point of the point system is to attract skilled immigrants to Canada. They need to have a way to evaluate whether the people are going to contribute to the economy or not, because Canada is interested in having like a net gain in terms of economic productivity. What I would say to this in terms of the social age analysis, though, is that the cutoff at 45 is very low. And it also contradicts the points you get for work experience. So to get work experience, you need to have worked for a certain number of time. But the older you get, the fewer points you get. So actually, this is a policy incoherence because actually you could argue that the older one is, the more experience they have, and so therefore the more valuable they are to the Canadian economy. But the other thing also is that there's this idea that somehow under the age of 18 and over the age of 45 are not contributing at all to the economy. And this doesn't actually capture the fact that people are undertaking roles, sometimes unremunerated, within the family or within family businesses. And some of Laurie's work and other people's work on this is important, especially on the young people contributing and working sometimes before they turn the age of 18. The second case study is on immigration detention. So again, in Canada, and also within international law, because there is so much overwhelming evidence that detention is not good for anyone, but detention is particularly bad for children who are in states of development, cognitive, emotional development. And so you're not supposed to detain children. It's supposed to be a measure of last resort. The other thing is that in immigration detention, you're not supposed to detain citizens because immigration detention is not criminal law. It's administrative. So it's not subject to the regular criminal justice system. And so you're not supposed to be detaining citizens. But what happens is that children who are born in Canada are Canadian citizens, but their parents are not citizens. So the parents are being detained. And then the parents are given a so-called choice between having the kids detained with them as guests. So they're not detainees, they're guests within the prison, the detention system, or they're put into social services. So obviously, in the most cases, families are choosing to have their kids detained with them. But until very recently, in the immigration detention centers, there was no family detention spaces. And so what would happen is that children would be detained with their mothers, which means there was also family separation from the fathers. And in cases where it was a single father, the children would be separated from their father. So they would be detained in an immigration system away from their parent, which undermines this idea that somehow they're being detained with the parent. The other problem with having children detained as guests is that they're not captured in the statistics. So until very recently, CBSA was not adequately counting those individuals because they weren't perceived to be detainees. So this is an example where it's supposed to be a positive discrimination in the sense that children are supposed to be exempt from detention. But then because of the way it operates, they end up actually getting discriminated against indirectly because they're separated from their families if they're not detained, or if they are detained, they're not actually counted as detainees, they're counted as guests. So the reason why we have immigration detention from a policy perspective is not because of criminality. I mean, the danger to the public is a very small minority of the reasons why people are detained. The majority of people are detained because they don't have proper identity documents, including sometimes those showing chronological age. So you also have the problem where in some cases, minor children, the age of minor children is disputed, so they're detained with adults, but also the risk of absconding. So the Canadian government is worried that people will not show up to an immigration appointment, and so that's why they're being detained. But when you look at the social age analysis, you realize that in fact, as I say, detention is not good for anyone, but it's particularly bad for people at both ends of the life spectrum. And there also is evidence to show that detention actually accelerates aging. So, and also the time in detention, which is indefinite. So Canada practices indefinite detention. So if you're charged criminally with an offense, you know that you're serving 5 years. With immigration detention, you don't know how long you're going to be in there. There's no limits on the time. And there's regular reviews, but it's very difficult because, again, you need to show new evidence in order to be released. So if you don't have documents, you're not going to necessarily have documents in 6 months' time. And so some people are detained for like years on end without knowing when they're ever going to come. So there's a temporality here, which also intersects with social age. So young people in particular feel like they're being stuck in this detention system, and that it's preventing them from getting on with their life, from going through the normal life cycle. And the third case study looks at refugee and humanitarian protection. This is a more complex case study. But what I will highlight here is that unaccompanied minors are supposed to have special protections. First of all, because they're an exception under the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States. This means that they're supposed to be able to allowed to be making a claim here in Canada. And also they have special protections, including a designated representative. So this is someone who acts on their behalf throughout the refugee claim process. So this is, again, an example of positive discrimination, recognizing that unaccompanied children, because of their family status, but also because of their age, need special protections. However, there are two negative associations with this. The first is that unaccompanied children, if they do get refugee protection, once they apply for permanent residence, are not allowed to list any family members on their application. Because basically the state is saying, if you knew about these family members, you should have migrated with those family members. And so they're worried that families are would be enticed to send their kids in advance and establish what they call a beachhead. So in other words, they're worried that people will send their kids here, the kid gets the refugee status, and then they're going to put on their permanent resident application all of their family members. I mean, this is not necessarily... first of all, sometimes families do make those decisions. We see that all around the world, including in the Mediterranean. But second of all, if someone has a legitimate refugee claim, they have a legitimate refugee claim. It's not really gaming the system if they're choosing to have one person make that claim as opposed to all coming to make the claim. And so what it means is that then that unaccompanied minor is like separated from their family until they become an adult, and then can try to do a family sponsorship, which again requires a certain amount of money. So often doesn't happen until like a decade or so later. This is an age disaggregated statistics of asylum claims in 2024. So you probably can't really read it, but the point of this age disaggregated study is to look at basically like the percentage of people coming in. And what it shows is basically you have people like middle age and below who are coming to Canada. So older people are a very small minority of the refugee claimants in Canada because basically they can't get here. Or they're unwilling to leave their country for the uncertainty of making an asylum claim in Canada. And the same thing happens with privately sponsored refugees. So this is a specific category, which is the blended visa office referred. So these are categories of refugees who are selected based on humanitarian reasons. One of the humanitarian reasons can be large families. And so, for example, when we had large-scale Syrian resettlement to Canada, they did tend to come with relatively large families because the UN had prioritized them as people in particular need. And so what you see here again is primarily a younger population that's being resettled to Canada through refugee resettlement processes. The other thing that's very interesting about refugee resettlement is that this is one of the few cases where the Canadian government defines family much more broadly and also accepts what they call a de facto family member. So say, for example, a single aunt, like a sister, an adult sister of a person is living with the family. That person could be deemed a de facto family member, and we would be resettled with the whole family. What is important to recognize here is we're talking here about private sponsorship. So these are people like you and I who are paying for these people to come to Canada. If it was a government program, then they would not be allowing this expansive definition of refugees. We'll see the same thing in the temporary public policies. So temporary public policies are policies that the Canadian government has enacted. These are enacted basically by cabinet. So they bypass parliament altogether. This is a politicized process. And so, for example, for Ukraine, you had unlimited numbers with no cap. Whereas for Gaza, for example, you have a cap of 5,000 and they need a family sponsor. So in the Gazan program, it's the family members who are basically here in Canada who are paying and who are telling the Canadian state that we will take responsibility, financial responsibility for people. So in these cases, the definition of family is also expanded because the Canadian state basically is saying, if you're willing to look after your own family, then we're going to allow them in. But if it's us who's paying or us who is admitting people, then we're going to keep it to the nuclear family. So in conclusion, basically what we see is that chronological age is supposed to be this administratively efficient, but also fair way of deciding who is included and excluded. But actually, we see that there's huge variations in chronological age. Similarly with family, generally speaking, the family is defined as a nuclear family, but in some cases, the family is expanded to de facto family members or extended family members if the family members are the ones who are taking responsibility for those individuals. We do see some good examples of positive discrimination. So I would say, especially in the refugee protection system, Canada has very progressive, child-friendly refugee determination system. However, we also see that in some cases, like in the cases of unaccompanied minors, even though they are protected, it actually results in them being separated indefinitely from their families. And the other thing that we see through this analysis is that really, when we think about immigration, it really is primarily an adult and often constructed as a male. And anyone else is perceived to be dependents. And we're not thinking about family, migration as a family unit. It was interesting, Lori, yesterday, because we were at the Canadian Council for Refugees, and the Manitoba Minister for Labour and Immigration said, and it's very surprising, she said, we don't want to have single people here. We're wanting to bring families here. But that's not the norm. This is like an exception to the way that people often think about immigration. So in terms of recommendations, the first I would say is that we need for a more systematic social age analysis of immigration policies in order to think more carefully about the ways in which age is being constructed, but also these family and other intergenerational power relations. And that we can't think of people as just individuals migrating here. People are also aging as they migrate. Right. So this is another aspect of it, too. People often, and this is even, for example, in our immigration system, when people make a claim or they make an application, the chronological age is fixed at that particular time. But sometimes these applications take years to process. And so people are aging as their applications are processed, but also once they arrive here. And so we can't just ignore that people are human beings who are in the process of, developing over time. We also need more data. We need more age disaggregated data. And even when we have age disaggregated data, and Lori would be better placed to comment on this than I am, but this is very frustrating to me. Like, why do we have 0 to 14 when 18 is the cutoff for a child? So we have no way to know actually how many under 18s are here. But then we also, I mean, this is actually fairly good at the upper ages, because sometimes it's only under 18 and everyone else. It's like, well, there's a huge difference between someone who's 19 and someone who's 60. Like that's, so again, I'm not suggesting we don't need chronological age at all. I'm saying that we need chronological age and we need age, like finely grained age disaggregated statistics, but we also need the other identity markers to be able to think about social age and age beyond chronology. We also need more information on older people. There's very limited data. I mean, we can see they're also a minority of the population, but they still exist. So we still need to understand what's happening with older people in Canada. We also need more age sensitivity. So the thing that really struck me as I was doing this analysis is the fact that some of the assumptions are not supported by empirical evidence. Like we know, there's a lot of information. We have migration scholars, including Lori and others, who've done really great studies over time. And many times those studies are not being taken into account. The empirical evidence is just not there. Like this idea that older people are not contributing, we know that that's not true. And so we need more age sensitivity so that these age stereotypes are kind of debunked. But also there's ageist language within the policies. Like, and this again shows that there's kind of this normalization of age discrimination within the immigration policy. And we need to really more systematically think about that. And finally, I would say that, again, age is an equity issue. It's one of the categories that's protected by the Charter. So why are we not advocating more on this issue? It's interesting to me because I think that we maybe are where gender was like a couple of decades ago with age. Like people are not realizing that this is a significant issue and they're not advocating and mobilizing around it. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.